friends, what I'm going to tell you today is a true story, one that few people have the courage to share. I know that many will doubt it, but I swear on everything that is most sacred that every word is true. I myself still find it hard to believe what happened, but the memories remain vivid in my mind, tormenting my dreams and haunting my days. My name is Jack, and until a few months ago, I was just a homeless man, like so many others in London. No family, no home, no prospects. My only concern was to find somewhere warm to spend the night and some food to satisfy my hunger. On that fateful night, however, my life changed forever. It was a particularly cold night, and the rain was relentless. I wandered through the dark streets, huddled in my soaked rags, desperately looking for shelter. That's when I spotted the entrance to an old, abandoned tunnel. Without hesitation, I entered, imagining that I would be protected from the storm. As soon as I entered the tunnel, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The air was freezing, and there was a strange smell that was hard to describe. Nevertheless, I kept walking, lighting an old cigarette lighter to illuminate the path ahead of me. As I progressed, the feeling of unease only increased. It was as if a sinister presence was watching me, keeping an eye on me. I felt like an intruder, like I was invading forbidden territory. But in my naivety, I decided to ignore these warning signs. I walked slowly through the tunnel, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed from the depths in front of me. It sounded like dragging, a slimy, disgusting sound. My instinct told me to run, but curiosity spoke louder. I kept moving forward, trying to make as little noise as possible. Then I saw something that would never leave my mind. A grotesque creature, deformed beyond imagination. Its thin grey body was covered in rough scales, and its long, twisted limbs moved unnaturally. But the worst thing was its eyes, two deep black cavities, empty of any trace of humanity. It was as if evil itself was staring at me. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or scream. The creature let out a deafening scream, an agonizing sound that made my blood run cold. Its disproportionate jaws opened, revealing razor-sharp teeth. She advanced towards me, her movements quick and awkward. At that moment, fear seized me, and I ran desperately down the tunnel. I stumbled and fell, dragging myself along the damp floor. But the creature didn't give up, its heavy, swift footsteps echoing behind me. Suddenly, I spotted a small opening on the side and threw myself in, panting and trembling. The creature rushed past me, sniffing the air with its dilated nostrils and letting out frightening guttural sounds. I stood motionless, praying not to be found. Every second seemed like an eternity as I listened to the sounds of the creature slowly moving away. Finally, everything fell silent again. After what seemed like hours, I finally gathered the courage to come out of my hiding place. My hands were shaking and my heart was racing, but I had to find a way out of that damn place. I walked slowly through the tunnel, observing every shadow, every dark corner. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Human remains littered the floor, broken bones and torn flesh. There were deep claw marks on the stone walls. At that moment, I realized that this creature was a ferocious predator, hunting and feeding on its unsuspecting victims. I was trapped in its domain, and I needed to find a way out quickly, before it came back. I hurried along, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly, I heard that agonizing scream echoing through the tunnel again. My heart froze. She had come back and was looking for me. I started running frantically, stumbling and falling, but always getting up and moving forward. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps getting closer and closer. At one point, I tripped and fell hard onto the damp ground. My knee was bleeding, but I couldn't stop. I kept crawling, desperate to find a way out. That's when I saw it again. The creature emerged from around a corner, its black eyes fixed on me. before I could react, it grabbed me by the ankle with its sharp claws, dragging me back into the depths of the tunnel. I screamed and kicked, trying to break free from its relentless grip, but it was no use. The creature was too strong, its superhuman power easily overpowering me. It dragged me into a darker area of the tunnel where my screams wouldn't be heard. That's when I saw the other bodies, the remains of unfortunates who had crossed the path of that bloodthirsty beast. Severed limbs, crushed skulls, guts scattered across the floor. The scene was so horrible that I almost lost consciousness. The creature immobilized me with its sharp claws, tearing at my skin. I could feel the warm blood running down my body. I screamed in pain as it drove its teeth into my flesh, ripping a chunk out of my shoulder. I watched in horror as she devoured my body, swallowing the raw flesh with her animalistic movements. The pain was unbearable, but the fear of dying in that terrible way kept me awake. I managed to reach a pointed stone on the ground, and mustering all my strength, I struck the creature's hard head. It let out a deafening howl and loosened its grip for a few seconds. It was my chance. I dragged myself across the damp ground, leaving a trail of blood behind me. The creature soon recovered and began chasing me again, its heavy footsteps coming closer and closer. I could feel the life draining from my body. The wounds were deep and the blood loss severe. But the will to survive kept me fighting, crawling desperately in search of a way out. I could already see the light at the end of the tunnel when I felt those sharp claws grab my ankle again. The creature pulled me back with brute force, dragging my wounded body across the rough ground. I screamed and struggled, digging my nails into the mud in a desperate attempt to break free. But it was no use. The creature was stronger, relentless in its hunger. It dragged me back into the dark depths, where the smell of death was unbearable. There it began to tear me apart with its sharp fangs, ripping chunks of flesh from my body. The suffering was indescribable. I screamed and begged for mercy, but those black, empty eyes showed no trace of pity. The creature devoured my raw flesh, swallowing with frantic movements. My blood gushed out and mixed with the mud on the ground. I could feel my life ebbing away, the darkness beginning to take over my vision. But even in that agonizing state, the will to live still burned in my chest. With the little strength I had left, I reached for a pointed stone and, mustering all my anger and despair, struck the creature's grotesque head with all the force I could muster. The impact was brutal, and the creature let out a howl of pain that echoed through the tunnel. Its sharp fangs moved away from me for a moment, and I wasted no time. I dragged myself across the muddy floor, leaving a red trail behind me. I could see the exit of the tunnel again. The streetlight seemed so close, yet so far away. My injuries were severe, and I could feel the life draining from my body every second. I gathered all my remaining strength and dragged myself out of that damned place. When I finally felt the cold night air on my face, I collapsed on the sidewalk, exhausted and bleeding profusely. I don't know how long I lay unconscious, but when I opened my eyes, I found myself surrounded by worried doctors and nurses. I was in a hospital, lying on a stretcher with tubes and needles sticking out of my body. The bright lights blinded me and everything seemed like a blur. I heard distant voices asking what had happened, but I could barely formulate words. The pain was excruciating, as if every inch of my skin was on fire. Gradually, I regained consciousness and told my horrifying story. I talked about the grotesque creature that had attacked me in the tunnel, its deformed body and its black, empty eyes. I described how it tore me apart and devoured my raw flesh without any mercy. As I recounted the terrifying details, the faces around me contorted into expressions of disbelief and disgust. They thought I was just another delusional homeless person, consumed by madness and drugs. But I insisted that it was all true. I showed them the deep claw marks on my body, the wounds that could never have been caused by any human being. I begged them to investigate the tunnel, because the creature was still there, waiting for its next victim. Some laughed, others looked at me with pity. No one believed my words. To them, I was just another madman spreading absurd horror stories. Over the next few days, more reports of mysterious disappearances emerged in the vicinity of that cursed tunnel. Homeless people disappearing without a trace, as if the earth had swallowed them up. But the authorities refused to investigate, convinced that it was just another crime wave among the homeless. I screamed and begged, showing my scars as proof, but they ignored me, treating me like a dangerous lunatic. Eventually, I was transferred to a psychiatric asylum where I was locked up behind bars, like a caged animal. But I knew that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next meal. The days dragged on in that asylum, an endless torture of loneliness and disbelief. I was treated like a dangerous madman, sedated and tied up when I insisted on telling my story, until one day, a group of policemen came to visit me. They said that more bodies had been found near the tunnel, grotesquely mutilated. Finally, they decided to listen to me. Wide-eyed, I recounted every sordid detail, from the first sighting of the creature to my bloody escape. I described its sharp claws, its pointed teeth, its black, empty eyes. One of the policemen even turned away, swallowing his vomit at my raw words. But I left nothing out, determined to make them face the terrible truth. They set off to investigate the tunnel, reluctant but obliged to follow all the clues. I waited anxiously, hoping that they would find some proof of the beast's existence. Days passed, and they returned. Their faces were pale, troubled by something they had seen down there. They said they hadn't found any sign of the creature, just a few scattered human bones. I shouted, indignant at their blindness. How could they ignore the evidence right in front of their eyes? But they just shook their heads and left me there, locked up like a dangerous animal. Over the next few days, more disappearances were reported. Homeless people mysteriously disappearing, leaving only trails of blood behind. But the authorities refused to admit the obvious, convinced that it was just another wave of violence on the streets. I screamed and banged on the bars, begging them to let me go, to allow me to hunt that beast down before it was too late. But they laughed at me, treating me like a crazy old man spreading horror stories. Until one day, a group of urban adventurers decided to investigate the tunnel themselves. Naively, they ignored my warnings, convinced that nothing evil could inhabit that abandoned place. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. Days later, their mutilated bodies were found scattered throughout the tunnel, confirming my words in a terrible way. Faced with the macabre discovery of the mutilated bodies, the authorities finally admitted that something very sinister was going on in that cursed tunnel. Reluctantly, they came to me, begging for answers. I told them everything again, every sordid and terrifying detail. I described the grotesque creature, its sharp fangs and black, empty eyes. I talked about how it tore me apart and devoured my raw flesh without any mercy. Some policemen could barely contain their vomiting at my raw words. But I didn't shrink back, determined to make them face the terrible truth that lurked in the depths of that place. They promised to step up surveillance around the tunnel to prevent more people from entering unawares. But I knew it was only a temporary solution. That beast wouldn't rest until it had fed on every soul that crossed its path. And I was right. Over the next few days, more bodies began to appear. Homeless people were found mutilated, brutally torn apart. The claw and bite marks were unmistakable. The media began to report the attacks, sowing panic throughout the city. But the authorities refused to admit the truth, fearing the chaos that would ensue if the creature's existence were revealed. They accused me of being responsible for the crimes, a mad serial killer spreading absurd lies. They increased the dose of sedatives, keeping me doped up and unconscious most of the time. But I didn't give up. With every moment of lucidity, I screamed and banged on the bars, begging them to release me to hunt down this beast before it was too late. Unfortunately, my warnings were ignored once again. More urban explorers, attracted by morbid curiosity, wandered into the tunnel, and they all met a grisly end in the clutches of that hungry creature. The mutilated bodies were found days later, confirming my words in a terrible way. Finally, the authorities admitted that something truly sinister inhabited the place. A few months passed, and the hysteria surrounding the tunnel only increased. Despite stern warnings and increased vigilance, there were still those fools driven by morbid curiosity. A group of urban explorers, convinced that they could face any danger, decided to enter the tunnel on a suicidal journey. They ignored all the warnings, certain that the horror stories were nothing more than urban legends. Naively, they entered the dark, damp tunnel, laughing and mocking the fear of the others. But as soon as they entered the depths, silence fell over them like a gloomy cloak. That's when the first screams echoed off the stone walls. Agonizing screams filled with pure terror. I could imagine them seeing the creature for the first time, its features deformed and its eyes black and empty. Within moments, the screams turned into visceral grunts, the sound of flesh being torn apart and bones being crushed. The beast had attacked with all its murderous fury. The explorers tried to run, tried to defend themselves, but they were mere insects in the face of the creature's supernatural power. One by one, they were slaughtered, their lives brutally taken. When the mutilated bodies were found days later, the scene was so horrific that even the most experienced police officers could barely contain their vomit. Severed limbs, crushed skulls, guts strewn across the floor. The claw and bite marks were unmistakable. Finally, the truth I had been proclaiming for so long had been confirmed in the worst possible way. The authorities had no choice but to admit the existence of this terrifying beast. My accounts, once considered the ravings of a madman, were now terrifyingly real. They came to me once again, begging for help, for any information they could use to stop that hungry creature. But I could only offer a grim warning. Nothing in this world could stop it. It would keep hunting, feeding on human flesh until the end of time. Despite all the warnings and the massive publicity about the dangers surrounding the tunnel, there were still those fools driven by an unhealthy curiosity. They wanted to see the creature with their own eyes, defying the forces of darkness. Entire groups of urban adventurers and urban legend hunters entered the tunnel, armed with cameras and equipment, convinced that they could face any threat. Naive, they mocked the fear of others, laughing at the horror stories I proclaimed so much. But as soon as they entered the dark depths, silence engulfed them, accompanied by an icy chill down their spines. That's when the creature attacked, emerging from the shadows like a demon thirsting for blood. Its movements were swift and precise, slaughtering its victims one by one. The screams of agony echoed off the stone walls, filling the air with the metallic smell of blood. The beast tore their bodies apart mercilessly, tearing off limbs and crushing skulls with its razor-sharp fangs. Those who managed to escape ran desperately, leaving behind a trail of guts and blood. But the creature didn't give up its hunt easily, pursuing them until their last breath. The few survivors were found days later, traumatized and mutilated, unable to talk about the horror they had witnessed. Their accounts only confirmed my words, fueling panic in the city. The authorities tried everything to stop the creature. They sent armed teams into the tunnel, but they were never seen again. Bombs and explosives were used, but they only served to fuel the beast's fury. Eventually, they admitted defeat and sealed off the tunnel entrance, erecting barriers and issuing stern warnings. But we all knew it was only a temporary solution. That creature was still roaming the dark depths, waiting patiently for its next meal. No barrier could contain it forever. And so the legend of the cursed tunnel spread, fueling the nightmares of generations to come. Some still doubt its existence, but those who have lived to tell the tale know that evil dwells among us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As for me, I remain locked away in this asylum, tormented by the memories of that terrible encounter. My scars will never fully heal, just like the wounds in my soul. But I find comfort in knowing that my story has survived, to warn the unwary about the dangers that lurk in abandoned places. Evil is always lurking, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim.